So it's been a minute since I've talked about the whole Wizards of the Coast and OGL situation and the backlash that they've received from the Dungeons & Dragons and tabletop community. A lot has happened since my last video titled Wizards of the Coast Apologize for OGL Disaster, D&D Community Reacts. This was published back in January 19th, 2023, and this is a good starting point. I kind of summarize a lot of what happened before this, and I have all of these sources down here that you can look at if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details. But for those who have not kept up, essentially, OGL, Open Game License, is what allows the D&D community to make their own custom content and even commercialize it, and it has fostered an open creative environment that has allowed the D&D and tabletop community to thrive. But Wizards of the Coast essentially compromised that by releasing and trying to sneak by the community a new OGL that makes the open part a lot more restrictive. They wanted to restrict stuff that basically wasn't printed media or electronic file formats like PDF. They were trying to enforce royalties as well as registration requirements that would allow them to surveil and just make it more inconvenient for third-party publishers and creatives to make custom content for D&D. Wizards of the Coast also put in a clause that allows them to modify or terminate the licensing agreement at any time, as long as there's a 30 days notice. They also essentially put in a clause that allowed them to use any content created by third parties under the new OGL, essentially steal content, use it however they want with no consequences, without having to compensate the original creators. It was just the worst kind of language you want from a quote-unquote open game license. So the backlash was swift and severe. Third-party publishers spoke out. A bunch of employees started leaking information because they deemed this whole situation to be so wrong and just so detrimental to the D&D community. And then eventually a number of prominent content creators got wind of this whole story, so a bunch of them spoke out. And eventually there was a campaign that got started that encouraged people to unsubscribe from D&D Beyond, and Wizards lost tens of thousands of subscribers, reportedly roughly 40,000 subscribers from this campaign. So that's hundreds of thousands of dollars a month that they lost. Now, Wizards of the Coast did respond by backpedaling on certain aspects and certain restrictions, but the way they gaslighted the community and the way they kept presenting the new OGL as a draft, as if they didn't plan to sneak it by the community, as if it were the final document. The way they continue to try to save face through subtle lies and manipulations, that all didn't sit well with the community at all, who was already very distrusting of Wizards of the Coast. So employees leaked even more information about how the immediate financial consequences of so many people unsubscribing from D&D Beyond and calling for the boycott of the new D&D movie and stuff like that. All of that led to them backpedaling. They didn't grow a bigger heart out of the blue, the executives, that is. Employees leaked information about behind-the-scenes sweetheart deals with certain specific third-party publishers who'd have to pay lower royalties, but the rest of the community were going to get screwed over, would be kept in the dark until the new OGL launched and be made the de facto new rule for licensing. There are leaks about Wizards of the Coast plans to raise prices for subscriptions to like $30 a month compared to the single-digit subscription prices that they have currently. And a lot of the blame was put on the executives rather than the designers and the creative heads, specifically VP Chris Kao. He's reportedly the mastermind behind this whole OGL debacle that completely backfired on him thanks to investigative journalism that led to this information getting exposed before Wizards of the Coast and VP Chris Kao could realize their nefarious plans. Eventually, Wizards of the Coast was forced to apologize through Kyle Brink, executive producer on D&D, who wrote the letter, but he's only been executive producer of D&D for 3 months after replacing Ray Winninger, an executive producer who was heralded and who was beloved within Wizards of the Coast before he left. Kyle is just kind of new to all of this. He's not really the mastermind behind all of this, but he kind of was made to be the face of all of this. He was treated as a scapegoat, essentially. Now, he did say, we're sorry, we got it wrong, but he continued to insist that the OGL that they were exposed on was a draft, which is just not true. Plenty of reports cite that this so-called draft was actually just the final version of the licensing document that was supposed to be snuck by the community. But on a positive note, Wizards of the Coast insisted that they are going to release an actual draft OGL to the public so they can get feedback from surveys, realizing that the backlash was too much for them to just weather out. And that finally brings us to all of the new information that I'm about to share today, starting with this series of tweets from D&D Beyond from back in January 18th, 2023 that aim to dispel what they claim to be misinformation that's been popping up, saying that this $30 subscription rumor or report that's been floating around, all that's false. That's what they claim. They also insist that no one at Wizards is working on AI dungeon masters. And then they addressed accusations that employees at Wizards of the Coast don't really look at survey feedback. That's something that YouTuber D&D Shorts reported, but Ray Winninger, who is the beloved former executive producer for D&D, actually debunked this by saying that actually, at least when I was in charge, we did look at the survey feedback. We did take that seriously. And so D&D Shorts kind of backpedaled on that front a bit. And on that front, D&D Beyond insists that we have designers whose core job is to compile, analyze, and then act upon your feedback, basically assuring that the survey that they're going to put up to get feedback on the new OGL, that feedback will be taken seriously. They are going to look at it. Now, further progress was made on January 19th, 2023, when the official Dungeons & Dragons Twitter page posted starting our playtest with a Creative Commons license and an irrevocable new OGL. This was a big step in the right direction. A Creative Commons license, for those who don't know, is one of several public copyright licenses that enable the free distribution of an otherwise copyrighted work. A Creative Commons license is used when an author wants to give other people the right to share, use, and build upon a work that the author has created. Clicking on this link embedded on the tweet will take you to the following blog post that reads, starting the OGL playtest, written by Kyle Brink. And it's detailed right here that we're giving the core D&D mechanics to the community through a Creative Commons license, which means that they are fully in your hands. Creative Commons is a nonprofit dedicated to sharing knowledge, and it developed a set of licenses to let creators do that. The Creative Commons license we picked lets us give everyone those core mechanics forever, because we don't control the license. Releasing the D&D core rules under the Creative Commons will be a decision we can never change. It's a one-way street. Once they do this, they cannot take it back. And that means that a lot of the D&D mechanics and elements will be open to the public to do what they please with. Stuff that falls in the Creative Commons means that you don't really even need to abide by an OGL because it is just part of the public Creative Commons. Now, at the time, the stuff covered by the Creative Commons was essentially D&D game mechanics, and some people called into question whether this really was anything, given that game mechanics can't be copyrighted anyway. As for stuff that doesn't fall under Creative Commons and would require you to sign the new OGL, that's stuff like the D&D races, classes, magic items, lore, all that stuff. You do need to sign the new OGL to make your own modified version of those D&D specific elements. And the new draft revised OGL is detailed here. Let's Talk OGL 1.2 reads this blog post. They assure that there is no royalty payment, no financial reporting, no license back, no registration, no distinction between commercial and non-commercial, which is a significant improvement over the initial final OGL, not draft, final OGL that was meant to be published and snuck by the community before they had to backtrack it. But one sticking point that Wizards of the Coast were insistent and stubborn on was the deauthorization of OGL 1.0a, saying that we can't use the protective options in 1.2 if someone can just choose to publish harmful, discriminatory, or illegal content under 1.0a. They insisted that revoking 1.0a had to do with them trying to protect people from harmful, hateful, discriminatory, or illegal content. But almost nobody really bought into the narrative that this was the sole reason why they wanted to revoke 1.0a. It became abundantly clear that Wizards just wanted more control over their own brand, over the D&D community, over just their ability to manipulate the IP to their liking. And so while this new draft OGL that they wanted to have a back and forth with the community was an improvement over the initial final new OGL that they planned to release, it still didn't tick all the boxes, but they did post a link here to a survey where people can provide feedback, stating here that the survey will remain open until February 3rd and that they will communicate again on or before February 17th once they have collected all the data. And on top of that, they actually posted a link to the draft OGL 1.2 so that people could take a look at it and provide feedback based on what they've read. This right here is the draft in question. I'll link it in the descriptions below in the sources section, but I can scroll down here and you can pause and read for yourself if you so desire. this is what that looks like. It's a decently extensive enough document, so it might be preferable to just use the link. Now, the Creative Commons aspect was something that people were not expecting and did garner positive feedback. Linda Codega, for example, the journalist from IO9 who kind of kickstarted this whole movement against Wizards of the Coast's attempt to change the OGL to not be as open, tweeted, "Holy shit, y'all, Dungeons & Dragons new OGL will be an irrevocable Creative Commons license." And Linda, at the time, believing that there was very little chance of Wizards of the Coast completely reinstating OGL 1.0a, said that this might be the best possible option here. And they explained in their article that Dungeons & Dragons new OGL will be irrevocable and bring mechanics to Creative Commons, and explained the Creative Commons license as it being something that will cede Wizards of the Coast control over the base rules and mechanics of D&D to the nonprofit that stewards the license. So that's still progress, just not enough of it, especially given that the main sticking point continued to be that OGL 1.0a would be deauthorized, which is something that people did not want. Somebody else who covered this new draft OGL was YouTuber D&D Shorts in a video titled "Wizards New OGL is a Mess of Lies and Actually Good Ideas." One of the things he argued was that based on the language at display in the new OGL, while it stipulated that content under OGL 1.2 will be irrevocable, meaning that it'll be protected, he did notice that the license as a whole was not fully protected. The license itself could be revoked, and so there was still a risk factor, because while the content is protected under the license itself isn't protected from other factors. And not to mention the severability clause that was in the new OGL, or the draft OGL, that said that Wizards can declare the license void if the license is deemed unenforceable or invalid for any reason. And just essentially putting the term "any reason" in there means that Wizards can decide in vague terms what they believe to be reasons for this license not working out and revoke it whenever they wish. It still gives Wizards too much power through their vague terminologies and their vague explanations in the license. Something else that the new draft OGL tried to reassure players and the community on was that Wizards essentially cannot steal your content, but at the same time, there's a clause there that says that you're not entitled to injunctive relief. And what that means is that while you can sue Wizards for money if you feel like they stole your ideas, you can't stop them from stealing, using, and selling your idea and work. Like, even if you successfully sue them, they can still take that work and do whatever they want with it. They might just have to pay you some reparations. So what they really did with the new OGL was say that we can suffer consequences for stealing your work, but that doesn't stop us from actually being able to steal your work and be able to use your work however we want. The new draft OGL also had a clause that essentially said you can't make content or engage in conduct that's harmful, discriminatory, illegal, obscene, or harassing. But at the same time, Wizards of the Coast stipulated that they have the sole right to decide what falls under those categories of discriminatory, illegal, obscene, or harassing, which essentially gives Wizards of the Coast all the power because they can make up whatever they want and say that it falls under those categories. But on top of that, there is the clause that you can't contest Wizards of the Coast decisions. When they say that this thing right here that you did is discriminatory, illegal, obscene, or harassing, even though you feel like it's not and you want to contest that, the license just says you're not allowed to. This is essentially vague language that allows Wizards of the Coast to terminate the license for any reason whatsoever. They can go through whatever mental gymnastics they want, even if their decision is unjustified, because they have final say, and you can't say otherwise. You can't contest their deliberations, so this essentially opens the door for Wizards to abuse this clause, and you essentially have to trust that Wizards won't abuse the clause, but there is no trust in Wizards of the Coast right now because of the way they tried to sneak by a new, much shittier OGL through the community. Wizards has proven that they're not trustworthy, so people are not going to trust that Wizards is not going to abuse a clause that is very much abusable. One last thing that was highlighted by D&D Shorts was that the new OGL essentially prevents third-party virtual tabletops from competing, or just cripples their ability to compete. So it's a very monopolistic way of Wizards of the Coast to approach trying to make their in-development Unreal Engine virtual tabletop the marquee, the default, the official virtual tabletop that can monopolize the virtual tabletop landscape. So that's another negative aspect to the OGL. And so right here, he presents solutions to the new OGL, providing his feedback, saying that the new OGL license needs to be fully irrevocable. It has to guarantee that it will be royalty-free. It has to let creators fight back if they feel like they're mistreated. They have to allow creators to appeal essentially a decision that Wizards of the Coast makes. And it is highlighted here that the virtual tabletop restrictions are way too much and clearly monopolistic in nature. D&D Shorts also took to Twitter to provide examples for why aspects of this draft OGL kind of fall apart, specifically the part about how Wizards can revoke your license, the OGL, for any reason they want, essentially by declaring something to be obscene or illegal or whatever, harassing or discriminatory, just based on their own criteria of what those words mean, which they don't detail, so it's super vague, highlighting a scenario where if you, say, get caught for jaywalking and get fined for that, technically that's illegal. So technically Wizards of the Coast could decide, hey, we heard that you jaywalked and you got caught for it, so that's illegal activity, that's illegal conduct, and they can use that as an excuse to revoke your license. This is a hypothetical scenario, but it's abusable in that way because the language is so just vague and so broad in nature. Like, yes, it's a bit of a stretch and kind of a joke, but also it is an actual possibility because of the way the OGL is worded. And in his video, he brought up how there are different laws for different countries. For example, marijuana is legal in some states and in some countries, and it's not in others. So, on that front, when it's such a gray area, how do you define whether that activity is illegal or whether it's obscene or whether it's not appropriate or whatever? If a higher up at Wizards decides that they don't like people smoking marijuana, can he just say that anyone who is caught smoking marijuana is going to have their license revoked because Wizards feels like marijuana is not a good thing to partake in, even though it's something that is legal in a number of states and countries, you know what I mean? And if Wizards decides that's inappropriate activity, because the clause that says you cannot contest their decision, you're just screwed without any ability to fight back. Now, Wizards of the Coast did assure through their official D&D Beyond Twitter page that the survey for OGL 1.2 feedback is now live, essentially showing that they are paying attention to feedback and that they're looking at what people want out of the new OGL. We also wanted to respond to a few topics we've seen pop up the past few days. We have seen people ask why OGL 1.2 doesn't explicitly say anything about money. That's because it's a free license. We'll make that clear in the next revisions. Hateful and harmful content is hard to define, and we know this is a sensitive topic. We're taking it and your input seriously. We'll clarify the language around this in the next draft and encourage your specific feedback in the survey, specifically addressing the vagueness behind how Wizards can revoke your license if they find your content or conduct to be harmful, discriminatory, illegal, obscene, or harassing. And finally, they ask for more feedback surrounding virtual tabletop policies because that's definitely a major sticking point. And so the gathering of feedback continued, but in the meantime, content creators and journalists continued to put pressure on Wizards of the Coast. For example, D&D Shorts at one point released a video titled "Every Insider Leak I've Been Given on Wizards of the Coast." It's a pretty interesting video detailing things like how executives were planning to essentially have a monopoly on virtual tabletops and were scheming to that end. Executives like VP Chris Kale also focused on a future where everything will be digitized and monetized, which just doesn't sound great, as well as plans to raise subscription prices. There were details in the video about the reasoning behind the new OGL, all of which sound pretty nefarious, and reactions within Wizards of the Coast as the new OGL was set to be introduced, and then once that was exposed, reactions internally as the backlash was coming in. And there were details about poor treatment of employees, poor working conditions, so on and so forth. Some good additional context to have about the egregious nature of Wizards of the Coast executives and how their goals are very much greed-driven rather than driven by their love for the D&D community and the tabletop community and trying to find a common ground where all sides can be happy. Over the next few days, feedback through this survey system would pour in. D&D Beyond tweeted here on January 25th, 2023, "We want to thank the community for continuing to share their OGL 1.2 feedback with us. Already more than 10,000 of you have responded to the survey, which will close on February 3rd, and they provide a link to the survey. And they do concede right here that so far, survey responses have made it clear that this draft of OGL 1.2 has not hit the mark for our community. Please continue to share your thoughts." On top of that, they admitted that their virtual tabletop policies also missed the mark. Animations were clearly the wrong focus. We'll do better next round. So there was some hope in that at the very least, they did seem to be taking the feedback seriously. But as people waited for revisions on the draft OGL, articles like this came out. Dungeons & Dragons has burned up all the goodwill. This was written by Linda Codega, who kickstarted this whole situation with an investigative report that exposed the planned new OGL that was going to be snuck through the community. And this is a worthwhile read about just the bridges that Wizards of the Coast has burned. Even with backpedaling and reparations made, this all just casts a dark shadow on Wizards of the Coast and how they truly view the community, or at least how the executives, the decision makers, truly view the community as essentially cattle to be milked rather than key pillars to why D&D has been so successful these past few years. Additional pressure came in the form of competitors seeing a surge after Wizards of the Coast screw up. Right here is a headline that reads, Paizo sells out 8 months of Pathfinder supply in 2 weeks. Paizo essentially being Wizards of the Coast's biggest competitor, or Dungeons & Dragons' biggest competitor. They're the creators of Pathfinder, and their stuff's been selling like crazy after Wizards of the Coast screw up, with many people essentially engaging in an exodus of D&D and trying to find other systems that will be less restrictive with their licenses. And then finally, at long last, came the moment of victory for the Dungeons & Dragons community when on January 27th, 2023, D&D Beyond tweeted the following: "Over the past few weeks, you, the community, have made your voices heard, and we have listened. OGL 1.0A will remain untouched, and the entire SRD 5.1 is now available under a Creative Commons license." And in the attached image, it reads right here, you got both options. You got SRD 5.1 available under Creative Commons, and you've got OGL 1.0A that's going to be untouched. You choose which you prefer to use. Additional information was provided in the blog post that covers all this, OGL 1.0A and Creative Commons. They got over 15,000 people to fill out the survey, and all of them, the majority of them basically said that they're dissatisfied with many of the elements that the new OGL tried to change, the deauthorization of OGL 1.0A. The vast majority expressed that they do not want to publish tabletop RPG content under OGL 1.2. Another big indicator is that 90% of responders said that they'd have to change some aspect of their business to accommodate the less convenient OGL 1.2, the more restrictive OGL 1.2. And basically, even though Wizards of the Coast had way more time to collect more feedback through the surveys, at one point it just became clear that people wanted OGL 1.0A untouched. You want irrevocability. You like Creative Commons. The feedback is in such high volume and its direction is so plain that we're acting now, they said. There's no need to prolong this because it's not going to make any difference because of the vast majority of voters all essentially saying the same thing. And so they settled early on leaving 1.0A or OGL 1.0A in place untouched, making the entire SRD 5.1 available under a Creative Commons license. The significance of that is explained right here by D&D Shorts in his follow-up video to this victory, essentially, titled Wizards Surrender the OGL, Wizards of the Coast Full Statement is Wild. Here's how he explains the advantages of SRD 5.1 becoming a part of the Creative Commons license.
They're putting the whole SRD 5.1 means that most people won't even need an OGL anymore, and once it's in Creative Commons, they really can't walk that one back. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, I haven't had a chance to speak to the lawyers yet, but I think that once it's there, it's not even theirs anymore. So 5e content will forever be protected, and they can't steal it, and they can't try and grab royalties. It's just out there.
So that's a pretty big deal, and it's honestly more than what people thought they were going to get out of this whole debacle. It is further elaborated here by Wizards of the Coast that this Creative Commons license makes the content freely available for any use. We don't control that license and cannot alter or revoke it. Once it's done, it's done. It's open and irrevocable in a way that doesn't require you to take our word for it, and its openness means there is no need for a virtual tabletop policy. Placing the SRD under a Creative Commons license is a one-way door. There is no going back. And finally, they provided a PDF linking to SRD 5.1 under the Creative Commons license. By simply publishing it, says Wizards of the Coast, we place it under an irrevocable Creative Commons license. And looking at SRD 5.1, you can see right here that beyond game mechanics, I mean, we've got races and classes and a bunch of D&D content that people can freely use and modify however they like under reasonable restrictions. This is really the best case scenario that we could have asked for. I mean, the ideal situation would have been for this fiasco to not have happened at all, but what we got out of this is, you know, after going backwards, we got back to the starting line, and we even got a little more than we bargained for. With SRD 5.1 now under the Creative Commons license, Wizards of the Coast can't try something like this again. We can rest assured that we don't have to just trust Wizards of the Coast on their word. By law, it's done. All this seals the deal that the open game license will truly remain open, and Wizards can't mess with it. Celebrations have spread far and wide. Linda Codega already covered this and said that I was such a pessimist about this aspect. Wizards of the Coast conceding on maintaining 1.0A, OGL 1.0A. I was sure this wasn't going to happen. I thought I was being realistic and I was being fatalistic. This is an incredible, huge win for fandom, and I'm so thrilled. Though Linda Codega does warn in their article that while this is a huge victory for fans, while the battle is won, the war might not be over. Everyone is waiting to see the four corners of the contract itself. Despite the SRD's entry into the Creative Commons, people still want to see the exact wording of things to make sure that Wizards abides by what they've said. And D&D Short celebrated by saying, "Holy crap, we won, shaking right now. Thank you everyone, I can't believe we did it. We stepped up to $1 billion company and knocked them on their ass." It's important to highlight that this was very much the D&D and tabletop community showing to a major corporation who really has the power. And when a community comes together and decides to take that power away from the corporation, they got nothing left. It is important to recognize that Wizards of the Coast and Hasbro didn't grow a bigger heart, but rather they got owned by the community. They changed their minds because they were losing power, because they knew they had no choice. If they continued with their old ways, then the community would abandon them and they'd lose everything. That's what forced them to change their mind, not kindness. Because unfortunately, money is the only language these corporations and these executives speak. Affect their bottom line in an impactful way, and they will not be able to ignore you. They'll have no choice but to listen to you. Beyond celebrations, though, there are safety measures that the community is putting into place. Apparently, a bunch of creators are working with lawyers to ensure that they can form a tabletop RPG creators association to ensure that every creator can retain control of their story. And you can read more details here, essentially asking people to stay vigilant and to essentially come together to add safety measures, just to double down on ensuring that Wizards of the Coast or similar companies can't pull something like this. Paizo, D&D competitor and the creators of Pathfinder, welcomed Wizards of the Coast backpedaling and reauthorizing OGL 1.0A, but still said that we believe there's a powerful need for an irrevocable, perpetual, independent system, neutral, open license. One that will, scrolling down here, serve the tabletop community via nonprofit stewardship. Work on the ORC license will continue, referring to the open RPG creative license that they're working on, with an expected first draft release for comment to participating publishers in February. They're continuing work on their own open game license, essentially just as an extra added safety measure. And to close things off, D&D Shorts aptly highlights the fact that if it wasn't for Wizards of the Coast's own employees, them leaking this information, we would not be here celebrating. And they did this under conditions where they were mistreated. That probably contributed to Wizards of the Coast employees saying that enough is enough, essentially, by leaking this stuff to media outlets and content creators. And he just goes on to insist that, you got to thank every employee at Wizards for speaking out and for just being so positive, for the people who do care about the D&D community, the people who are not executives, for actually giving a shit about the D&D community and doing their part in a victory well won by the D&D community and a loss well-deserved by Wizards of the Coast, or rather the executives at Wizards of the Coast and the executives at Hasbro. So yeah, after a tumultuous few weeks in the D&D and tabletop community, we got a happy ending. And hopefully in the future, when corporations try to screw over a community, people can look towards this whole debacle for inspiration to realize that it is ultimately the communities, the customers, the people who have the power. And when communities are united against a powerful entity, that power can easily be stripped from them. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings us to the end to this saga. I hope this all proved to be informative. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on how all this plays out and what your prospects are for the future of D&D and tabletop with these developments. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.